Middle East, a modern name for a region shaped by millennia of conflict and faith. From the Crusades to the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, its history is marked by sacred visions and imperial designs. And we understand its present shape by studying its layered past.
My name is Mattias Hessérus, and I'm here with Professor Stephen Kotkin, and we are going to discuss Russia and its position in the political geography of the world and what to make of its future. So, Stephen, let's start there. How should we position Russia in this political geography of the world?
It's actually not a simple question, as simple as it sounds. Russia is actually everywhere, and that's the challenge of understanding. Russia is a Near Eastern country, it's a European country, and it's an Asian country all rolled into one. But its self-conception is that it's an entity entirely unto itself, a kind of Russia-Eurasia civilization. If you unpack it a little bit more, in the three regions that I mentioned and Russia's relationship to them, geographically, it's clearly a Near Eastern country. It's been yearning to take over the Straits, the Turkish Straits, for hundreds of years. You can't take over the Turkish Straits unless you're not that far away. Also, you have to remember Russia's on the Caspian Sea, in addition to the Black Sea. Russia's oldest city, the oldest city in contemporary Russia is Derbent, which it acquired from Qajar, Iran in the 19th century. And one could go on in this vein to demonstrate that Russia is a Near Eastern country, not exclusively, but also. You could talk about the origins of the Russian state from the Golden Horde, a kind of Turkic Muslim offshoot of Genghis Khan and the old Mongol Empire. The Russian ruler, the Grand Prince of Russia, had to be blessed as the Grand Prince by the Muslim Khan in order to have that role, and that continued through 1480. You could go on and talk about Ivan the Terrible's conquest of Kazan and folding in the Muslim Tatars into the Russian nobility. Catherine the Great's conquest of the Tatar Khanate in Crimea, which was a continuation of this Slavic Tatar amalgam that I'm mentioning. Anyway, there are just a number of indications that you would say Russia is certainly part of the Near East, geographically, but also historically. Russia's a European country, too. You can't imagine European culture without Russian music, Russian dance, Russian art. We all understand that Alexander presided over one peace settlement after Napoleon was defeated, and Stalin presided over another peace settlement after Hitler was defeated. And one could go on about Russia's connections to Europe, of course. But Russia is not Western. European, but not Western. Western is an institutional concept. It's an institutional matrix. It's about rule of law, freedom, limitations on executive power. Japan is not a European country, but it is a Western country institutionally. And so Russia is fully European, but not Western. It's very important. And the third, the East Asia piece, Russia's been on the Pacific Ocean since the 17th century. And of course, Vladivostok, the city in Russia, rule the East would be the translation into English. For a time, Russia was in command of Alaska. Russia had settled parts of where I live now, Northern California, and one could go on. Russia's position in the Far East is not a secure one. It's never had a substantial population out there. The Russian Far East population is under 10 million today, which is smaller than a Chinese city. if you compare Japan, North Korea, or any of the other Northeast Asia countries. So Russia's got a precarious perch in East Asia. It's got a close tie relationship to Europe, but not institutionally Western. And it's got a deep and abiding presence in the Near East, which shades off into the institutional matrix of Russia as well.
So what you are saying is that Russia's historical and geographical position as a vast land-based empire contributed to its, maybe we can call it authoritarian and maybe patrimonial political culture.
Patrimonialism is an idea we get systematized from Weber as an ideal type. And it's just a really important concept to help us understand political regimes. Nowadays, we talk about authoritarianism. Allusions to fascism are invoked quite frequently. This is fascism, that's fascism. Nothing we have today in the world is really comparable to fascism. Fascism imprisoned and murdered millions of people. If you've seen one newsreel about what fascism was about, with millions of troops in the streets in their brown shirts or their black shirts, marching, lawlessness, no limitations on the executive, but also the murderousness of the regime. Patrimonialism is more ancient than fascism, and it's more enduring in some ways. And this is where the state and the private interests of the ruler are erased, so that the state is treated more like a family household, a family business. And so there's a kind of conflation of state interests and private personal interests of the ruler and then anyone else who's part of the ruling apparatus. Patrimonialism was normal for a really long time. If you had an emperor, a king, a queen, a duke, the feudal system where the lords had manors, but also private armies and tended also be the judges in their jurisdictions. Patrimonialism shouldn't be understood as something bizarre or something that is unusual. It's normal. It's just less normal in the modern age because a different form of government, which we call constitutional order or classical liberal order, where you have separation of powers, where you have a distinction between the state interests and the ruler's interests, where you have terms like corruption, which is identifiable behavior that violates norms, as opposed to the whole system equals corruption, and there's no violation of norms. The norms are the private interests of the individuals who control the state apparatus. So patrimonialism has endured in only a few places that have not succeeded in assimilating this modern constitutional rule. Most of those places remain hereditary monarchies. So, for example, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Oman, to a lesser extent, but similarly Kuwait, one could mention Bahrain, where they all have hereditary rule and where there is tremendous overlap between the interests of the ruling families and in many cases, the ruling family and the state. Russia is unusual because it lost the monarchy, as you know, in 1917, but it's retained the patrimonialism to a very great extent. And so that's a really important puzzle for us.
Why is that? Because it seems that patrimonialism is maybe particularly stubborn in Russia.
Yes.
And one can wonder, why didn't the Romanovs and then the Soviets overcome it?
So many people, especially people from this region, those who are native to the Baltic Sea and have close experience of Russia over multiple centuries, some of which have been part of Russia, not always voluntarily, let's just put it that way, they might point to culture, DNA, that there's something about Russia that it's sort of eternally autocratic, that it's in the mother's milk, as it were. I don't really buy those arguments. You might have made those arguments in Sweden several centuries back. You might have made those arguments in the UK, the land of England, in the land of Magna Carta. For a while, it looked like you had an unbreakable monarchical, absolutist monarchical system, but then it was broken. So I don't buy the culturalist DNA-style approach. Mine is something I call perpetual geopolitics. And what I mean by that is the aspiration to be a power of the first rank, to be a providential power or a power under God, to be maybe even the number one power in the world, but certainly in the ranks of those powers. That aspiration has persisted in Russia for a really long time, but its capabilities don't match that aspiration. And so there's a gap between Russia's aspirations to be a power of the first rank and Russia's capabilities. The trick has been to use the state as an instrument to try to manage the gap, to try to either close the gap with the powers of the first rank, close the gap between aspirations and capabilities, or at least to manage it. And this investment in a strong state, where the state browbeats the society to try to compete internationally with powers of the first rank, this has devolved again and again into personalist rule. The Romanovs had a version of this. The Soviets had a version of this. Today's Russia has a version of it. They're not identical versions. Things do change over time, and nothing is identical in history, but it's a recognizable pattern.
What would you say are the main differences if you look at sort of Romanovs, Soviets, and today's personality cult?
The property systems, right? The extent to which you have private property, or private property is actually merely the will of the ruler to bestow or take away property. So we have that now in Russia, where the ruler can expropriate property, but we have much more private property in today's Russia than we ever had in the Soviet case, for example. And that's really important because, as you know, the ability to create private wealth is a form of power and is a form of independence from state rule. And authoritarian regimes like to have control over property, control over employment, control over universities and life chances in order to bend people to their will. So the more that you have private spaces, the more that you have a society that is not 100% or even 80% controlled by the political regime. The aspiration is the total control. But the ability to control is limited by the property regime, for example. So I could give other, the technological sophistication, for example, surveillance or lack of surveillance, communications technology, how far things are, so that if it's 6 months for you to get information from the provinces, you're not going to be able to use that as your personal property to the same extent as if it's instantaneous communication. But by and large, we have this pattern where Russia, not alone, the United States wants to be a power of the first rank. China wants to be a power of the first rank. It was true of the UK for a long time. It was true of France. It was true of Germany. It was true of Japan. It was beaten out of those cases, the German and Japanese case, by the total defeat in the war. And in the UK and French case, it was lost over time, reluctantly, because of the decolonization when they lost their overseas colonies, although it persists in some fashion, certainly in a cultural sense with English language and French language. But for the most part, they no longer aspire to be the powers that run the world. Russia still aspires, but as I said, doesn't have this capability. So time and again, we see this massive overinvestment in the state, in repression, in the military, browbeating of the society, forced modernization. There's often a spurt that accompanies this, and then there's this period of stagnation where they hit a wall, where the model is not competitive against the liberal powers that are powers of the first rank. And so then you get this devolution into personal rule and the conflation of the interests of the personal rule with the state, and this patrimonialism where they take away or they reward businesses to people. So, for example, when the Western businesses left Russia because of the war, either through the sanctions regime or voluntarily because they didn't want to be associated with, somebody got that property. That property was distributed by Putin and his inner circle to friends of the Tsar, as it were, to the court society. Again, the challenge for them is it's not hereditary, right? In hereditary monarchies, they don't have the succession struggle to the same extent. There's ambiguity there. Is it the brother? Is it the son? Is it the first wife's son? Et cetera, et cetera. But on the whole, the succession mechanisms are more manageable with hereditary monarchs. So Russia has this enduring patrimonialism because of its geopolitical aspirations and the failure to achieve that in terms of capabilities. And it's a remarkable story, and one day we hope it will be broken, as it has been in other cases, but it persists now. And it resembles the Near Eastern hereditary monarchies much more than it resembles European countries or East Asian.
So what countries in the Middle East would you compare Russia with in terms of patrimonialism and sort of political system?
Yeah, another really excellent question. So the Middle East is variegated. We don't have a single political type in the Middle East. It's a complicated story, patchwork. We have a theocracy in Iran. We have democracies in Turkey and Israel. We have constitutional monarchies in Bahrain and Kuwait. And then we have more classical, if you will, if I can use that term, patrimonial regimes, as I said, in the Saudi case, in the Emirates, in Qatar, and in Oman. Of course, Kuwait has a lot of patrimonial tendencies, and the parliament doesn't have the kind of power that a parliament would have in a place like Sweden, so it's not an analogous constitutional system, but it has more of a constitutional system than the classical patrimonial regime. So without simplifying and understanding that the Middle East is variegated, Russia nonetheless resembles a significant number of Middle Eastern countries with this patrimony. And so patrimonialism can be a system, as it is in these countries that we're talking about, or it can be tendencies. So you can see patrimonial tendencies where the ruler is trying to overcome institutional constraints, trying to overcome property laws, trying to overcome the judiciary in a patrimonial aspiration to make the rule of the family and the state, right, overlapping in order to make it personalist rule, patrimonial rule, as Weber discussed. You know, Weber's insight was that the world bureaucratized, and there arose these state structures that were independent of the personal ruler and that would then persist, endure after that ruler was removed, whether by legal means or illegal means. There would be this bureaucratic continuity, and there was a different type of power, loyalty, obedience, etc. And so the irony of the patrimonial regimes is that they create these gigantic states, strangulation-sized states, but the states are weak because they're undermined by the ruler undercutting the laws, undercutting the regulations, and the ruler ruling whimsically by caprice, the ruler treating everyone and everything as patrimony of the ruler at any given time. And so you get the worst of all worlds. You get the gigantic strangulation state, and you get the patrimonialism that overrides the very laws that they pass.
And you also, of course, have the risk then of popular uprisings, which we have seen in the Middle East. Do you think there is a risk of a sort of a Russian spring?
Yeah, so we have to understand revolution. It's a really deep and profound problem. We think of revolution as something that society does, that sort of happens in the streets. People are angry, usually at the corruption. The corruption is one of the great mobilizers. Also, issues of dignity and self-worth and condescension and mistreatment and repression in addition to corruption. But that's not where revolution comes from. Revolution comes from the fragmentation of the elites and a division such that new elites want to unseat the current regime, meaning that they're in the system and they break from the system. They defect from the current system, either because they're trying to protect their position in defensive mode, or they're trying to aggrandize because they have tremendous ambitions. And so whatever happens in the streets, and there are a lot of courageous people that risk everything and anything to go out in the streets and protest the corruption and the injustice. And we have to understand how important that is. It's not easy to risk life and limb on behalf of justice or fairness or dignity. But if nothing happens in the elite structures, you can end up with the street courage, the courageousness of the society, not to be institutionalized and not to get the kind of revolution of transformation of institutions. You can go from a military regime to a military regime. It may be a different military regime, like what happened in Egypt. It wasn't the exact same personnel. But you went from one to the other despite the courageousness of all of those people in Tahrir Square and elsewhere who rose up against Mubarak's military regime. We ended up with Sisi's version of that regime. So revolution is complicated because you have to follow the fragmentation and defection of the elites, which means that if you're up against an authoritarian regime, your goal has to be encouraging elite defection. Your goal has to be fragmenting those elites even more than they're already fragmented and using the natural animosities inside any large authoritarian regime against the regime itself. So if you push from the outside with sanctions and you sanction everybody and anybody, that throws them into the arms of the ruler again. So rather than divide them and deconflate, as it were, the personalist rule in the state, you reinforce that mechanism sometimes unwittingly. So if you want to combat authoritarian regimes, you need to pay close attention to and encourage, promote this elite defection. Now, again, sometimes that comes from the street. Sometimes that comes from the courage of the society, and the elites are either inspired by that or opportunistically want to take advantage of that. And that can be very important dynamic, but ultimately it's in the corridors of power that these things happen. So we're looking in the Russian case to see. There's a lot of disaffection among the elites. How could it be that they could form something against the ruler, not necessarily, again, because they are pro-Western, pro-democracy, but they may perceive as patriots that Russia's trajectory is hurting Russia, that the war in Ukraine is hurting Russia, that Russia's long-term interests are being undermined by this personalist regime. And there's quite a lot of that sentiment in Russia today, but we haven't quite managed to work it to our advantage. And so we focus on the democratic opposition, the people who go to demonstrations, the people who are imprisoned, a lot of them are forced into exile. And that's an important story, but I'm interested in this defection of elites.
Is there a counterfactual version where Russia would have gone in a much more Western direction and more liberal, creating much more of a liberal order?
Certainly, many people had that aspiration. And many people fought for that. And there have been moments where the Russian state has either imploded or it's cracked open. We sometimes conflate anarchy with freedom. So if institutions break or they implode, if the secret police dissolves or is in disarray, we think, oh, there's freedom now. But freedom is a series of institutions that guarantee, right, liberty and property. And institutionalizing freedom is a really big challenge. You can break an authoritarian regime, and that's only one step. The next steps are much harder steps. And that institutionalizing freedom in a moment of state implosion and anarchy and lack of personal security for people in society and massive redistribution of property, for example, that's not always conducive to institutionalizing freedom. So actually, evolution rather than revolution has been much more successful globally in institutionalizing freedom over time. If you take the French Revolution case, which is a really important case for Russia, you cannot say that the French Revolution institutionalized freedom because it ended in Napoleon. And then after Napoleon was gone, there was another Napoleon. And it took a full century for the French Revolution to play out. really until you got to the Third Republic that you had the kind of institutionalized freedoms that we would recognize today. And even that was undone in Vichy, right? And so the French, a remarkable achievement, what the French have. Tremendously successful society. So when you ask this question about Russia, what you're asking is, could Russia ever become France? In other words, France, absolute monarchy, revolution, very large bureaucratic state, all characteristics that are close to Russia. If there's any country in the world that is close to Russia, it would be France. Now, of course, there are tremendous differences as well. We don't want to oversimplify here. Russia is much larger geographically, and the geography we were talking about earlier is very different from France's geography. Nonetheless, if you look at the case of France, that's the answer to your question. Could Russia ever become France? And are there moments where it was on that path and it got diverted, something else happened, but it could return to that path one day? And the answer is yes, that could happen. But the difficulties that France had becoming France gives you an indication of how difficult it would also be for Russia, potentially. You can also measure where Russia is today compared to France and how far Russia has to go compared to the France that we know today. More likely is this elite defection and retrenchment, where the elites, again, out of patriotism, not out of pro-Westernism, feel that the Putin trajectory is damaging to Russia, and they want to retrench, meaning they would like to cut a deal over Ukraine that Ukraine would accept in order to concentrate on rebuilding Russia at home and making Russia viable in terms of human capital, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of better governance. Again, not necessarily democratic. And then there are other futures that are possible for Russia involving the trajectory they're on, which is subordination to China. So the irony is you have a Near Eastern country geographically and institutionally in many ways with strong ties to Europe that always lent themselves to Russia's prosperity. The closer Russia was to Europe, the more prosperous it generally has been, and yet subordinated now to East Asia, far from Europe, subordinated to China, still with some Near Eastern style institutions. Again, not in a cultural sense. I'm not speaking about a cultural affinity with the Near East. I'm speaking about the nature of the institutions, the governance structure. This is about geography and governance, not about culture and civilization.
So if we think about this patrimonial model we've been discussing, do you see it as related to Russia's aggressive posture in foreign affairs as well? Has that something to do with the patrimonial model per se?
Yeah, that's another great question. So is regime type related to external behavior or not? This is a fundamental debate that you know well from international relations theory. The so-called, democracies never fight against other democracies. So to be fully secure, you need to democratize the more democracies, the more secure we all are, versus autocracies that tend to repress their people at home, tend to behave aggressively abroad. And so in the case of contemporary China, for example, many people are worried that if they treat their own people that way, they'll behave that way externally. Whatever they might say rhetorically, their behavior derives from regime type rather than from pursuit of interests or definition of interests. So they might not pursue a peaceful integration policy abroad based on the regime type. That's a difficult question to answer because you can't run the counterfactual by changing the regime type to see if it would have behaved differently in its extra. So you can conjecture a little bit about this, and you can take some cases to compare, but it remains a conundrum about regime type and external behavior. I'll say this, though. These regimes are insecure. They're fundamentally insecure. For all of their bombast, for all of their sense of being providential, of being powers under God, of having the mandate of heaven, or whatever case you want to invoke here, they have this fundamental insecurity as an undercurrent inside the boastfulness. And that fundamental insecurity means that the existence of liberal powers, regardless of the policies of liberal powers, is ipso facto a threat. So there are kinds of governments which are appealing to their own domestic populations in the autocratic patrimonial regimes. And that's dangerous for them. And that's dangerous even if the liberal orders, even if the liberal governments, the liberal powers are not promoting democracy per se or not promoting it aggressively. Just their very existence is a threat to these insecure regimes. There are so many ways that the values, belief systems, institutional behavior can corrode the legitimacy, the loyalties of their own people, and can inspire those people against those regimes. So those regimes are correct to perceive the threat. When they argue that the U.S. is supporting color revolutions against them, this is wrong. The U.S. doesn't have that kind of sophistication or, sadly, intent to do stuff like that. The U.S. is mostly passive and inert, not understanding how to go up against these, reactive in our policy more than proactive. But the existence of the U.S., the existence of the European Union, the existence of NATO, the existence of Sweden and the Nordic countries dialogue, all of that is itself the threat because it's a superior model, and it's a model that even if they don't believe is superior, some of their people might believe is superior. It appeals to their own population, and they have a hard time suppressing that and keeping that out. So this filters into our assessment of what type of external behavior they might engage in. So it doesn't have to be invasion, as it is in the case of Ukraine. It could be what we now call gray zone, hybrid war, never-ending, 24/7 interference in free societies, taking advantage of their openness and doing things like undermining their social stability, promoting polarization or encouraging additional polarization. In other words, they can interfere in these societies using some of the tools of modern communications in ways that take advantage of the openness because they're afraid that these societies are a menace to them regardless of their policies. So people say NATO is not really necessary, NATO has outlived its usefulness, then why is Russia trying to take it down? Why are they spending all of those resources and people hours and energy to try to undermine NATO from within? Why are they demanding that NATO roll back to its pre-1997 position if NATO is a paper tiger, if NATO means nothing? And the answer is NATO is not a threat in the sense of an aggressive war against Russia, obviously. But it is a threat in the sense of undermining or exacerbating the sense of insecurity that comes from being an illegitimate regime that its own people might choose differently against if they had that free opportunity.
How can Russia break out of this vicious cycle of patrimonialism and aggressive foreign adventurism that you have identified here? Do you think we will see it happen in our lifetimes?
I hope so. I don't know how much time I have left. You certainly have a lot of time, and I'm optimistic that you may see it. Again, it's about changing institutions over time. Sometimes more slowly than we would hope. We're always wanting things to go more quickly, especially now in the mass communication, social media age that we're in. I would put it this way. How did Poland do it? Here you have a country that was behind the Iron Curtain, was a Soviet satellite. And now, Poland, for all the disappointments that some people might or might not have over this election or that election, has elections, and they're free and fair elections, and they reflect the will of the people. It's got an open society. It's got a very strong society. Poland, like Ukraine, has an amazingly strong society. The difference is Poland has these institutions. And how did that institutionalization happen? Let's remember that Poland is about to pass Japan in per capita GDP. And Poland and Ukraine were not that different in 1989, 1991. It's just astonishing what Poland has achieved. And they did it because they aspired to join the European Union. And to join the European Union, you had to undergo institutional transformation. There were conditions for admission. And those conditions were not easy. And Poland didn't meet them 100%. Certainly Romania didn't meet them 100%. We could talk about Bulgaria. We could talk about many cases. But there was a significant institutional transformation in these places, driven by the aspiration to join the peace and prosperity that Europe clearly represented. Sure, Europe has a regulatory apparatus that is sort of like Jack the Ripper or some other strangulation metaphor, if you prefer. And Europe needs more innovation and less regulation. And there are many things we could say about Europe. Some people can be disappointed in the way that the EU operates. But nonetheless, they overcame the fratricidal wars. The EU is an achievement to overcome fratricidal wars. And they served as a model and as a mechanism of conditionality to help transform Soviet satellites, and in the cases of the 3 Baltic states, Soviet republics, into classical liberal rule of law regimes for all their disappointments. Now, the Baltic states were not as long in the Soviet Union as the rest of the republics were. Now, Russia is a different proposition from the Baltic states or even from Poland. But nonetheless, if it can happen in those places, it's not out of the question that it could happen. So Russia would need some type of relationship with European institutions. You know, when you trade with corrupt countries, you have to engage in corrupt practices. And when you trade with rule of law countries, you have to abide by their laws. And so this is one reason why the people in Georgia were against trade with Russia and wanted trade with the EU. Trade with Russia was very lucrative, but it informed the institutions, or if you will, deformed the institutions of the country, because you became Russia-like in your relationship with Russia, because that's how you had to manage the trade with Russia. And so if Russia could have more Europe in institutional terms, a deeper relationship with Europe in institutional terms, then you can see an evolutionary pathway here. Never part of the EU, perhaps, never part of NATO, perhaps, maybe some other formation, some other structures, some other intermediaries. But Russia burned those bridges to Europe and then accused the US and the Europeans of being the arsonists.
Stephen Kotkin, thank you.
My pleasure, Mattias.